All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris, and I'm the host for the Lunchtime Discovery presentations here inside the Daily Planet Theater within the museum. I'm curator for the space. The presentations themselves, though, are scheduled and managed and maintained by the very awesome efforts of the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality over DEQ. So Lisa and Marty within the Office of Environmental Education do a great job sourcing and bringing in speakers. And then here within the museum, we're glad that we can offer up the space. And we also live stream and record all of the talks. So welcome to everyone who might be watching this online as well. And if you want to go back, we have all of the talks for the last several months all archived, so you can learn something new every day and go back and check the archive. Find me if you're interested in that, and I can get you links. This week's Lunchtime Discovery presentation is one that faced a minor setback back in November due to water. How about that? Although not the kind of water that our guest works with. A water main broke right in the road over here, and so we had it was terrible all day long. There was no way to do anything here in the building, so we've postponed to today, which is great. Today, we get to hear about the work that Olivia Caretti is doing at North Carolina State University. She's a PhD candidate in marine, earth, and atmospheric sciences at NCSU, and she's using underwater microphones to study what life is like underwater off the coast of North Carolina. This one is going to be cool, and I know that because she was interviewed on WUNC not too long ago, and I listened to the interview, and it was really good. She did a great job. So, put your hands together and welcome to the Daily Planet Theater, Olivia Caretti.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for coming out this afternoon, and thank you to everybody who's live streaming right now as well. So today I'm going to go into a little bit about what I've been doing as part of my PhD at NC State University. So my interests lie in understanding how underwater systems work generally. And so we're using this really cool new tool, sound, and tapping into natural sounds to get a better understanding of what's going on in these underwater systems that can be really challenging to study. So when you think of an underwater environment, you might picture something like this. If you've ever gone scuba diving, in Hawaii or the Caribbean, you go underwater and you open your eyes and there's this beautiful blue water just going off into the expanse of the ocean. And you might see some things on the seafloor, you might see some corals, you might see some rocks, you might see some fish. But what this image isn't capturing is that there's a lot of other things going on underwater that you might not necessarily think about right away. So you might actually be experiencing something like this. So the underwater environment is highly dynamic, and there's a lot of sounds that are being produced by organisms that live under the water. So this provides a really cool opportunity for us, like I said before, to kind of tap in and learn from these sounds. So the sources of sound underwater are pretty expansive. You might hear sounds from geologic processes. So these are things like thunderstorms, rain events, waves on the surface. During hurricanes, for example, the underwater soundscape is super loud because you have all this water moving and churning the sand, and there's waves crashing. We also capture sounds from anthropogenic activity, so boat activity, fishermen traveling out to oyster reefs, to offshore reefs for fishing, and also shipping traffic. So I'm sure people have probably seen in the news lately or recent scientific work that people are doing a lot of work to try to figure out how anthropogenic sounds might be affecting underwater life. So that's kind of a different side of the coin that I'm working with, where we're actually listening to these biological sounds. So shout out to Little Mermaid, from fish and invertebrates that are actually vocalizing underwater. So really what I'm using is these natural sounds and listening into these natural sounds. And so together, all of these different sound types create something that we call the soundscape. And the soundscape is basically just the acoustic landscape of the underwater system. So biological sound production can be created in multiple ways, really 2 ways that we really care about. So one is active sound production. So active sound production would be something like a fish making a sound. So for example, I'm up here talking right now. We communicate with one another by talking. And so fish have similar and slightly different mechanisms to speak to one another underwater and to produce sound. There's also passive biological sounds, and these are sounds like, for example, a parrotfish munching on coral or on algae on a coral reef. And so those sounds are sort of byproducts of an animal's behavior. So I'm up here walking around right now, and my feet might be making noises and clicking kind of on the floor, and that's not necessarily a direct sound that I'm making by actively producing sound, but that's kind of a byproduct of my behavior. And so we see both of these sound types underwater created by fish and invertebrates. So what is the biological role of sound underwater? So we know that animals are making sound either directly or indirectly, but why are they doing that? So some work that came out of our lab group several years ago looked at how animals use sound to navigate. So for example, oyster larvae, so spat or juvenile oyster larvae, can actually hear underwater sounds from distinct habitat types, and they can hone into those sounds and find their place to settle. This is also true for a lot of other organisms, whether they're larvae or large fish, trying to navigate to find a home or find their specific habitat. Animals can also use sound for communication. So like you and I communicate, you talk to each other. It's kind of the same thing. To communicate with others, conspecifics, for whatever reason, we can't necessarily speak fish that well yet. Like some people can speak dolphin and interpret dolphin sounds, but we can still understand that these fish are actually using sound to communicate with one another. So for example, a lot of fish will call to one another for reproductive purposes. So in the summer, for example, in North Carolina, there are a lot of species that form these very large aggregations, and they call to attract other conspecifics to those aggregations for spawning purposes. And so that communication is really important because they need to self-sustain their population, so spawning is a really important behavior for fish, so sound is a way to help them do that better. Fish might also create sound to communicate if they're territorial. So some fish species, like this grouper pictured up in that cinder block, live in tiny crevices in reefs or artificial reefs that are built offshore, rocky substrates, oyster reefs, or seagrass beds, and they are really, really territorial, and they have their little home space, and they don't want anybody else coming by. So when that happens, if another fish is coming in, they might make a sound to startle them and scare them away and say, hey, this is my home, get out of it. So if you have like, you know, a neighborhood dog that kind of just comes by your flower bed all the time and you want to say, hey, get out of my yard, that's kind of the same sort of thing. And then lastly, fish might be making sounds for an injury or startle response. So some smaller fish may detect a predator nearby, and to scare that predator away from them, they might make a really loud sound to scare the predator and make the predator think that they're a lot bigger than they really are. Fish and invertebrates also use sound for hunting and foraging, so finding food, which is obviously a really important behavior. So we're probably most familiar with echolocation. So everybody here probably knows that dolphins create a sound that bounces off of fish, and then they listen for that sound coming back, and they use that to navigate to where those fish are and to feed. That's probably what we're most familiar with. So there are other animals that use sound to capture prey. For example, this snapping shrimp here. We're still trying to figure out why they might make sound, but one thing that people have seen is that when they snap their claw, they actually might stun little larvae and small fish that are swimming nearby. So that's a way for them to eat. And then finally, there's also been some work that has shown that large predators like sharks can actually listen for seabirds diving in the water where big bait balls are present at the surface. And so they'll listen for this splashing, and they can actually use that to navigate to where those bait balls are located and feed. And this is really important in the open ocean where there's not a lot of fish at the surface of the water. So it's really important for these animals to be able to listen and to communicate. So what information can we get from all of these sounds that these animals are making? So we kind of know why they make sound, but what information can we take away from this? So the soundscape is really useful for getting information about what species are present, when they're present, and gives us an idea of what they're doing. So for example, those fish that are making the spawning coral aggregations, we know that they have a specific type of call that is used for spawning. So we can look in the soundscape for these calls and we can say, okay, so we see this specific call at this specific time, so this might be really important for us to identify locations or times when these fish are calling and when they're present, which is important for conservation. And then together we can look at all these different species that are present in the soundscape and get an idea about the biodiversity of a specific habitat. So yeah, I kind of talked already about spawning locations and times. And then we can also look at the community or species recovery and response to disturbance events. So for example, we've had 2 large hurricanes in North Carolina in the past 2 years, Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, that created huge inland flooding, and that inland flooding eventually reached the coast and flooded the estuaries with fresh water. So a lot of species in those estuaries are somewhat freshwater tolerant and some aren't. So we can actually look in the soundscape and we can see when some species might be finally coming back into the system after that fresh hit event. And that's really important for understanding how dynamic the system is and how it can recover. Also, for example, in the Florida Keys in 2017, Hurricane Irma blew through and did some really bad damage to some of those coral reefs. And so I actually have a lab mate who is looking at the recovery of coral reefs from Hurricane Irma using sound. And so we can see the same thing when certain fish start calling again to look at when they're coming back and when that habitat is being used again. And so together, all of these points give us a really good idea of the health of a habitat overall. All right, so why oyster reefs? Well, oyster restoration has become really important in North Carolina and all along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the US, and also worldwide. And we recognize all the benefits that oyster reefs provide. They provide food for us, they provide water filtration, they provide habitat for fish. So my interest is in the habitat for fish component, which obviously people are really into fishing for recreational purposes and also for commercial fisheries because we all love our seafood. So habitat restoration basically recreates a habitat structure, which is really important in altering the biodiversity and species composition of fish that use that habitat. And then that together provides really important ecosystem functions and restores those functions to before the habitat was degraded. So really we want to make sure that these oyster reefs are providing the same ecosystem function after they are restored compared to their historical function. And we know, like I said, that oyster restoration in North Carolina has become huge. Especially in the past year, we've passed a lot of legislation and people have made a lot of work towards improving aquaculture and restoration statewide. So this is a screenshot from the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries Culch Planting Program online GIS app. And so all those little yellow triangles are oyster culch reefs that have been restored since 1980. And so you can see that in all of Pamlico Sound, there's been a lot of effort in rebuilding these oyster reefs. And that's been really good for improving oyster harvest for fishermen, but there's still a lot of information that we're missing about the role of these restored oyster reefs, especially on their whole entire ecosystem function. So we still don't really know, are they providing habitat for fish? How long are these reefs around? How long is the fish community using them? And what does this mean for overall success of these restoration events? So this is really important in forming my questions for my PhD. So what I've done is said, okay, I want to look at the restoration success of these programs in terms of restoring that fish habitat. But the problem is, when you go underwater in Pamlico Sound, it looks like this. And you really can't see anything, so it's super hard to measure, to do visual fish surveys, to measure oysters, to get any information about what's going on these habitats. And it's also challenging with traditional methods like nets or traps to capture the temporal dynamics, or the sort of dynamics over time of what species are using that habitat. So this is where sound comes in. So can we use sound as a way to assess these community responses to restoration in a system where it's really hard to collect other types of data? So it's kind of hard to see this map, but my study sites are located in southwest Pamlico Sound, and we've monitored a set of restored oyster reefs that were constructed by the Division of Marine Fisheries. So we've looked at reefs made out of marl, which is a limestone rubble, reefs made out of recycled oyster shell, which is a very old school traditional method of restoring reefs, and then reefs that are made out of a rubble or a marl base with a shell veneer. So there's a bunch of different methods that DMF has been using, and also other places like in the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, where people are trying to use these alternative substrates for oyster settlement and for oyster reef design. So we've looked at several types of reefs, and then we've also monitored unstructured muddy bottom habitat as a control to see how do these reefs compare to these habitats where there's nothing there. So we monitored these using habitat surveys, so that required measuring oysters and actually creating maps of the reefs. We used traditional fish surveys, and then we also complemented this with acoustic surveys, which is what I'll talk to you about today. So all these reefs were built in the summer of 2016, and then we started monitoring them immediately after they were built, and we have a 2-year continuous data set of sound to look at how these reefs have sort of changed over time, and looking at the function that they're providing for those fish and invertebrates. And that picture in the upper right is of our hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone that we use to measure the sound. So it's this waterproof little computer with a microphone at the tip, and we leave it underwater for like 2 or 3 months at a time. So that picture is after we brought one up after 3 months one summer. And so you can see that there's a lot of things growing on it. So there's a lot of stuff going on underwater at these sites. All right, so what do I want to get out of this acoustic data? What do I want to learn from it? So first of all, I want to know who's there, what species are calling, when are they there, when are they calling, and what are they doing? We don't really know yet, so let's find out. So when I talk about the soundscape, I'm going to talk about 2 different components that are really important for understanding what's going on and what species are present. So we record a lot of different frequencies or pitches of sound. And these animals are making sounds in these different frequency bands. So for our purposes, I'm looking at low frequencies, which are sounds like the sort of grumbling in your stomach, those really low-pitched sounds. And these are made by fish. So for example, croaker, silver perch, speckled trout, these are common fish species that we see in North Carolina estuaries that are making sounds in this frequency band. We also look at high frequencies. So these are greater than 2,000 hertz, and this is where a lot of invertebrates are making sounds. So for example, snapping shrimp, snaps, and also the sounds of crabs. So this image is of a mud crab or a stone crab, which we see in some North Carolina estuaries, but not in Pamlico Sound. So pretend it's a mud crab. So we have sounds like crabs feeding on oysters, snapping underwater, grazing on things, rasping on the material of the reef. And then we also actually see fish that are making sounds in both bands. So for example, the oyster toadfish and red drum, as we know, are major predators of some of those crustaceans that are living on oyster reefs. And so we can actually potentially pick up sounds from them eating things on the reef and crunching. But they're also active sound producers. And so toadfish and red drum also make sounds in that low frequency band when they're calling. So we get a lot of information from just looking at these different frequency bands. All right, so next I'm going to walk you through some examples of the calls of the dominant sound producers that we see on these oyster reefs. So we have about 8 terabytes of acoustic data over 2 years, which is a lot of data, and there's no way that I can listen to all that probably in my lifetime. It would take a long time, several decades, and I don't want to be doing my PhD for that long. So what we do is we actually visualize sound using these things called spectrograms. And a spectrogram is basically a plot of the sound. So time is on the x-axis, and here it's in seconds, so this is like a 1-second clip of sound. Frequency is on the y-axis. I keep forgetting I have this. Frequency is on the y-axis here, so those low frequency sounds are going to be in the bottom portion of the graph, and higher frequency sounds will be in the upper portion of the graph. And then color corresponds to the loudness of the sound. So how loud is the sound? And the warmer colors, like the red, are representative of louder sounds, and then the blue or cooler colors is either quieter sounds or a lack of sound completely. So this is an example of an Atlantic croaker call. So there are these 4 major red bands here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And those are really impulsive calls. So I'm going to play the sound for you, so just listen, and you'll hear a sort of knocking sound. And that's what these croakers sound like. Knocking, right? So there's a lot of these different really cool sounds, so I'm going to keep walking you through. So croaker is one of the dominant sound producers on these reefs, and they make sound all the time, every day, all night long, pretty much the whole year. They're very chatty, and they definitely dominate our soundscapes. So next is the oyster toadfish. As everybody knows through the name, they live on oyster reefs. They're really important on those reefs for eating small crabs and fish that feed on oysters. So they play a really important role in the oyster reef ecosystem. And so these calls, so this is another spectrogram, so these calls are represented by these bands, and each of those little dots next to them, those are called harmonics. So they make these beautiful sort of like boop sounds, which I'll play for you in a second. I'm not good at making fish calls. And they actually dominate the soundscape in the spring and the early summer when they're chorusing and calling for mates. That's probably our favorite fish call. You can tell why. So next is silver perch, and these are a highly transient species that occur throughout a lot of North Carolina estuaries. But they also use these oyster reefs for spawning. And they're spawning in the spring, and their sounds kind of sound like a chattering sound. So you'll notice here on the y-axis that we're going from 0 to about 7,000 hertz. So they're fairly broadband, meaning that their calls span a lot of frequencies. So they sound sort of like a chattering sound. Pretty cool. My other favorite one is speckled trout, and everybody is probably familiar with speckled trout because they are really heavily fished recreationally. They're very popular sport fishing for inshore North Carolina, and they actually also play a very dominant role in the soundscape. So they chorus at nighttime in the summer, so they've already started by now because in North Carolina the summertime starts in May. And they call all summer long. So they are a very dominant sound producer. And we see them very reliably starting at the same time every night at every site of ours. And they sound sort of like a growling sound, so they're very low frequency, a sort of growling, grunting sound. And then our last fish, which will hopefully pop up. There we go. So this is a red drum call. Oh, it's already playing. So I'll play that again for you. So red drum, as you just heard, are very low frequency, and their name implies that they make a drumming sound, and they do. So these are our images of their calls. And red drum we actually see show up in the soundscape in the late summer. So they also chorus at night, but they are only making sound from like the end of August through middle of September at my site. So they're definitely more of a fall, late summer species. And they also play a large role in the soundscape as well. So those guys are almost difficult for us to hear because they actually vocalize partly out of human hearing range. And then lastly, one of our other major sound producers is the snapping shrimp. And so these guys are about the size of this little clicker. They're very small. They're actually probably smaller than this. They're very small, but they make some of the loudest sounds in the ocean. And there's actually recordings from like the 1950s when sonar was starting to be used by like naval officers and stuff from the military plans that say that there's all these sounds underwater and we don't know what they are. What is this? And they thought that it was actually German U-boats. But they're actually snapping shrimp. So it's really cool because these shrimp are making some of the loudest sounds in the ocean, and they're only the size of your finger. So these guys make really broadband sounds. So like I was saying before, those high frequencies is where we see these sounds. And so for reference, all those other calls that I just showed you are making sounds all the way down here at the bottom of this figure. And these guys make sounds that span almost the whole frequency range that we record. And a lot of people say that they sound like bacon sizzling or like a fire cracking. Pretty cool. All right, so that's a little bit of a snapshot of some of the dominant species that we hear on these sites, but they're not really usually chorusing by themselves. We actually see that a lot of these fish and invertebrates call at the exact same time. So, to assemble the entire chorus, if we look at a spectrogram, it would look like something like this. So this is 20 seconds from one of my Oyster Reef sites in the springtime in May. And we see a lot of different species. We see some trout down here, there's some perch, some snaps are up there. There's even calls in here that we can't see because all that red is just covering it up. So if you listen to it, you'll hopefully be able to pick out a couple of the species that I just played for you. So listen closely. Pretty cool. So hopefully you guys heard some toadfish, you heard some perch, you probably heard some of those trout growls, and maybe even some croaker knocking. So it's pretty cool because what we actually see is that each of these species fills its own specific acoustic niche. So while they overlap in time, they're parsed out in different frequency bands, and we can actually pick that out, which is really cool. So we can look at these and we can, for the most part by eye, pick out what species are calling, and we can listen to it, and our ears are even better detectors than our eyes and can pick out all these different species. So we can learn a lot about who's there just from looking at these snapshots. So moving into a little bit more about what I want to get out of this data, hopefully you have a good idea of who's there and sort of when they're there. But from the human perspective, we want to know, well, what can we learn from this? What can this information tell us about these habitats and the role of oyster reefs for these fish communities? So the first thing that we see is that on those unstructured sites, so remember, all the way back to the beginning, we're monitoring different habitat types. So we also have these muddy bottom unstructured sites to measure as a control. And what we see on those is that the community composition as measured through the soundscape doesn't change over time at all. So I'm going to show you a series of spectrograms from the same exact time each year of our study. So remember, time is on the x-axis, so this is 1 minute. and frequency is on the y-axis. So this is a clip of a spectrogram from one of our recordings from September 1st of 2016 at 8 p.m. And we choose 8 p.m. I wanted to show you guys that because that's when a lot of species start to chorus at nighttime. So this is right after these reefs are restored, like a couple weeks after they're built. And what we see, again, this is only a muddy site, so the reef timeline doesn't really matter, but that's when we start monitoring. And so what we see right away is that there's almost no high frequency sounds at all. And instead, the soundscape is dominated by these low frequency calls. What we see the following year, so 1 year after those other reefs were restored, in 2017, at the same time, so September 1st at 8 p.m., is almost exactly the same as the year before. And we see the same pattern again in 2018. So what this means is that on these muddy bottom sites, the same type of fish are calling through time, essentially, and it doesn't change. So we would expect all these sound recordings to sound the same. However, on those oyster reefs, we see something different. So this is a spectrogram from the same time, September 1st at 8 p.m. in 2016, so a couple weeks after the reefs are built. And we see something that kind of looks like the previous slide, where we see those low frequencies dominating the soundscape, but there's not really even that much going on. And there's almost no high frequency sounds. So this is what this would sound like. That volume is turned up all the way. It's really just that quiet. So there's not a lot going on right after these reefs are built. But if we look a year later, so the same time, September 1st at 8 p.m. in 2017, we actually see a pretty big difference. And hopefully you guys notice right away that now there's a lot of high frequency stuff going on in the soundscape. So that means that there's probably some invertebrates that are living there now and making sound, and there's probably some fish that are actually feeding on oysters or feeding on those invertebrates that are living within the reef. And we still see some of those low frequency fish calls too. So this is what this time at 2017 sounded like at this site. So noticeably different, right? So if we look 2 years after the reefs were restored, we see something even stronger, where now the soundscape is dominated by those high frequency sounds. And it's hard to see because they're kind of washed out by the other stuff, but there are still some fish calls down here too. So now we see a more developed soundscape, which probably means that the reef community itself is more developed, and we do have some fish data that backs that up. So this is what 2018 on September 1st at 8 p.m. sounds like. But there's a lot more going on. Hopefully you guys can notice that difference. And this is really cool because this basically means that the sounds that we're recording are reflecting the colonization of those reefs by different animals. So biologically, if we kind of make an image of this in our mind, this is what this would look like. So here we have time on the x-axis, sort of. Our reefs are first built over here, and then over time we start to see certain species popping up in the soundscape. So probably there's first a lot of fish that are visiting the reef, then some more fish come by, and then finally we really see those reefs being colonized by those invertebrates, those benthic fish species that are living in the reef and on the reef, and that are really important for gaining information about the function of that habitat. The other thing that we see, so that's looking sort of over time, how things are changing. The other thing that we see is that we actually see differences between these different reef types. So remember again, we're looking at marl reefs, which are made out of those sort of alternative substrates, that limestone substrate, oyster reef shell, and then we have reefs that have that marl base with a shell veneer on top. So the veneer is just a thin layer of shell on the top. So what I'm going to show you guys, so hopefully you'll notice our frequency on the y-axis again. And so this is in kilohertz, so this means thousands of hertz, so we're looking on a pretty broad frequency range for these. So these are what I call average spectrograms. That's what they're called, not just me. And so what this is a month of data in September that has been averaged. So all those spectrograms on the previous slides, imagine all of those averaged together for one time point. So I'm going to show you things like this for each year for each of these habitat types. So what we notice right away is on these marl reefs, again, they're dominated by these low frequency sounds in 2016, so right after those reefs are built. But right away, on those other reef types, at the same period of time, right after they're built, we start to see that there's already differences between these reef types. So whereas the marl has only low frequencies, these other sites start to show some of those higher frequency sounds, which might mean that things are colonizing them a lot faster. If we look at 2017, so this is September of 2017, so a year after those reefs were built, we see on these marl reefs, we start to see some of those high frequencies showing up. But on the shell and the mixed reefs, so those two reefs with shells, or two reef types with shells, we actually see those patterns are really strong. So the initial increase in those high frequency sounds and the presence of low frequency sounds becomes even stronger 1 year after restoration. So these reefs are developing a lot faster than those marl reefs, which is really interesting for helping us think about the design of these restoration projects. And then in 2018, 2 years after the reefs were restored, we see, again, sort of an even stronger pattern. So from 2017, we see on the marl sites, we see more high frequency sounds, but still a lot of those low frequencies. But on those shell sites, we actually see mostly, dominated by those higher frequencies. And there are still low frequencies in there, but we just, we kind of see this full red bar, which means that there's things vocalizing in all those frequencies, which means that there's probably more things vocalizing on those sites than the other sites. And obviously not everything makes sound. So, there are caveats to this, but this is a really cool way to just look really quickly at these changes over time and these changes between habitat types. So what does this mean biologically? So this probably means that on those marl reefs, part of the community is still missing. So those crabs, those invertebrates, and maybe some of those other fish that are eating those things might not be present yet on those marl reefs, or might be present in fewer numbers. So I'm finished sampling, but it would be really cool to see if that ever does develop on those other reefs. So again, like I said, this is really interesting because it basically means that these processes are occurring at different rates on these different reef types. So hopefully you guys got some cool stuff out of this talk. Just to summarize really quickly, what have we learned about what oyster reefs, or about what acoustics can tell us about oyster reef communities? So we already identified who's there from looking at some of those dominant sound producers, and there are several more. One thing that's really interesting is that we know maybe 5% of the calls of fish. There are thousands of fish species that make sound, but we don't actually know what their sounds look like. So that's a really, really cool thing moving forward that this sort of field of soundscape ecology is trying to do, is actually find out, well, what other fish make sounds and what do their calls look like? But for my study, we're at least able to identify several species, and we figure out when they're there, and we get a really good idea of what they're doing based on what time they're calling and what those calls look like. Secondly, we also see that we can use acoustics to show how those reef communities change over time. So remember, the reefs become dominated by those higher frequencies after restoration, and that really changes over time. And then lastly, those dynamics and that sort of rate of colonization through the soundscape varies among those habitat types. So this might mean, again, that not all restored reefs function similarly or function equivalently, which might not be a bad thing because some of those, so for example, the marl reefs might provide a different habitat type for different species that maybe don't make sound and we don't capture in the soundscape. But I think this has really cool implications for the design of oyster reefs when we're thinking about restoration. So with that, thank you all for coming and listening. I really appreciate everybody live streaming in and sitting here with me today. And I'd also love to thank my co-advisors, Dave Eggleston and Del Bonensteel at NC State University, and then my wonderful lab mates, some of who came today, and for all their help with the field component of this project, because it was a doozy. And then also all my collaborators and funding sources for all their support through this project. So thank you so much, and I will happily take any questions you may have.
Let's give Olivia a round of applause. Thank you very much. If you've got questions and you're down here with us on the first floor, wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone. That way everyone in this space can hear. If you are up on the second or third floors and you have questions, if you see me looking up, you look down, wave, and then yell your question, and we can use the microphones to repeat. We'll make sure that everyone in the room can hear.
How did you isolate the individual sounds for each organism you looked at that you were able to have it for each specific one? How did you isolate that?
So we've identified times in those 2-minute so I'm recording for 2-minute segments. So we identify files with some of those calls, which we can actually see pretty easily. And then I basically just zoomed in and changed the resolution of those files. I actually had an undergrad who was here, who was working with me this semester to go through and actually help identify calls. So she's done a really good job helping me identify some of these calls and working on really isolating individual calls. So that's been a big process that we're working on. And what we're going to do with that is we're actually going to build a call detector that is going to go through all of our files and find and count the number of calls of each of those species so that we get really good data on call rate and we can look at how that changes over time in addition to those other components of the soundscape. So we're just getting a little more detailed with that, yeah.
So within the context of the health of the reef itself, the oysters, you're giving us, through what you're doing, a snapshot and understanding of the biodiversity, but is there some way to translate that into some understanding of how healthy the oyster reef itself is relative to the oysters themselves and their numbers?
Right, so I didn't talk about this today, but part of the study was also creating bathymetric maps, so maps of the oyster reefs themselves. So we've quantified the complexity or features of that habitat, and we've looked at how that's changed over time. So for example, has the reef been sedimented over? How much of the reef has been lost? And then we've also measured oysters themselves. So we have data on oyster density. We've measured recruitment of larval oysters to those sites. And so just to give you a snapshot, the reefs with shell have recruited significantly more oysters than those marl reefs. So I think the soundscape provides a way to view how organisms are actually feeding and using the more oysters on those reefs. So really, habitat health here would, yes, include the oysters, the structure of the habitat, the fish, and the soundscape itself. So that's sort of the end goal. I would say, from what I've shown you guys today, biodiversity is increasingly being shown as an important way, or playing an important role in the health and the sort of resilience of habitats. And so I think with more diversity and more diverse communities on these habitats, that probably means that there are other things that we're not measuring that are also performing at an optimal or a higher level on those reef types.
Based on catch data from the sound, are the noisiest fish the most abundant ones, or is there a lot of the biomass that's just not contributing to the soundscape?
Yeah, good question. So probably from our data, we capture probably the most menhaden, which don't make sound. There is actually some work being done that shows that they do make sound passively by air passing through their system. So essentially fish farts. And so, like I said before, we're still learning about a lot of the sound signatures of some of these species. From our catch data, we do capture a lot of croaker and spot, which make similar sounds. And we do capture, we definitely capture all the species that I've shown you here. Most of that biomass is I think it depends on the time of year, whether it's species that are making sound or species that are not. But that's the point here, is to complement those methods, those traditional methods. So yes, not everything makes sound, but we can use the sound to get a better idea of the abundance of some of those species that we can't really capture well. So for example, you never catch toadfish in a net because they live really within the reef. And so for toadfish is a good example of where the acoustics will be really important for helping to quantify the abundance of those toadfish on the reefs compared to, for example, like a gillnet or a trawl, where you might be able to capture other species that might not be making sound.
I am terrible with microphones, so excuse me, but I was just wondering, I know you mentioned that there are a lot of restoration efforts along the East Coast and Gulf Coast, and with my work on the Chesapeake Bay, I know that they've used concrete reef balls. Is there any benefit to using a certain or a particular type of artificial substrate, or did y'all not really look at that?
So the opportunity was presented to us to measure these different reef types here. We haven't looked at any of the concrete, and I know that there was a big restoration for the Swan Island oyster restoration stuff in North Carolina, and they're using granite. So I think the jury's still out on what's best. I know that there have been a lot of studies that look at oyster settlement on the different material types, and I think a lot of people have shown that concrete does well, which is why people in the Chesapeake Bay are using it. In terms of the whole community, though, I don't know if that's really been looked at yet. So I think the jury's still out. I think in terms of settlement substrate, concrete probably does fairly well. But in terms of the entire sort of community development, I'm not sure if I can speak to that yet.
I have a question.
Yep.
What are the spatial limitations of a hydrophone? How much sound from how far away do they pick up, and how does that impact studying these different reef sites?
Yeah, good question. So these reefs that we've studied are fairly two-dimensional. I mean, there's definitely some ridges, there's some three-dimensional relief to them. So it depends on how complex or how vertical your habitat is. So for us, I would say that we can detect sounds a couple hundred meters out. They might be very quiet, and we might not be able to detect them audibly or visually, but that's where that sort of detector will be really helpful in helping pick out sounds that we might not be able to see as humans, but that the hydrophone will still pick up. If you're doing work in a canyon, for example, though, you're obviously going to be sort of blindsided on two sides, so you might not capture sound as far away. It also depends on water depth, but ours, for the most part, I would say probably like 500 meters is our best estimate for a distance that we can capture sound. And these reefs are much smaller than that, so we know that we're capturing sound from the whole reef, and we're probably also picking up sound from some of the marshes nearby, some of the deeper channels nearby. So moving forward, I'll be looking at the context of these different reefs in terms of the sort of embayments that they're in to help us get a better understanding of where fish are coming from and how they might be using those reefs.
I need to glance up. If you're on the second floor, wave at me if you've got questions. Also, I'm curious about the oyster life cycle and what might be the difference between the marl bottom and the oyster recruitment versus shell that gets dumped. What would be the difference to an oyster larva?
So oysters use a bunch of different cues to settle. So one is chemical like odors from conspecifics. So if there's already a lot of oysters there, then they'll be enticed to settle. They also depend on a bacterial film that grows on top of the substrate. So we haven't really quantified any of those things. Like, we haven't quantified the bacterial film at all on these different types of habitats. But I think what's interesting is we've actually looked at the response of the settlement of oysters to those high frequency sounds. And we see that that might actually be an important cue for them to kind of create like a self-sustaining feedback loop. And that's been shown before by previous students in our lab, but this is probably the first time that we've shown it in sort of a natural setting and not in a manipulated experiment. But the oyster life cycle is obviously very complex, and they use a lot of cues to find where to settle. So I would say on a farther, maybe like farther out, they're using those, they're being pushed around by currents. They might pick up the scent of conspecifics or the sounds and then come down, and they actually can explore the bottom before they decide to cement themselves. So they, the texture and the material itself of the reef or of the substrate also might play a role too in terms of the chemistry of the shell versus the chemistry of the marl. But these aren't things that we're measuring. So I think there's definitely been work done on some of that stuff before. So that would, I could look it up.
When you finish your PhD writing, are you going to drop an album?
Yes, we have a running joke that we're going to make a best of Pamlico Sound album and a fish chorusing Christmas album. So if anyone's interested, I would be happy to look into that. I know that a couple of my lab mates and I have talked about that, but we'll see.
Let's give Olivia one more round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming out today. Appreciate it. Great work. Thanks for sharing. And hey, thanks to all of you for coming out to the Museum of Natural Sciences today. Hope you enjoyed this week's Lunchtime Discovery presentation. We'll be back here next Wednesday at noon with another great speaker and another great topic. So I hope you'll find us again and visit the museum soon. Bye, everybody.